We are in John chapter 4 this morning, as Ashley read to us, making our way through the Gospel of John. We're going to get there in just a few moments, but I wanted to just share with you something that I thought about this week. I don't necessarily watch TV very much. Streaming services are just an easy way to get the information that I want to have. But once in a while, I'll see something on the television, and there's an ad now that's coming out, and it's a Carfax ad. And I was just all excited to share this with Dave Lemieux, and I said, there's a Carfax ad, Dave. And Dave says, what was that all about? Let me just show you what it looks like. It's basically an advertisement for a service that will tell you whether the cars that might look identical with each other and have identical price tags are actually not what they appear to be, and hence, Carfax is of value to you. And the ad talks about this woman who wants to buy a car, and she asks her dad from Sarasota, actually, that's what the ad says, from Sarasota, to tell her which car is the right one. And I don't know, that guy does look kind of like a dad from Sarasota, doesn't he? You know, and there he is, and he's looking at them both, and he's sure that this is the one. And Carfax is actually encouraging you to not trust your dad from Sarasota, because appearances can be deceiving. That's what the ad is all about. And the reality might look more like this. We see two cars, and they might look the same, but this one actually, if you purchase it, the story ahead of you is not going to be the story you want to have with that vehicle. Actually reminds me of a time when I didn't check the Carfax and bought a Honda Civic for my daughter, Meredith. And we just thought it was a great car. You know, Honda Civic's great reliability rating. I enthusiastically purchased this. And then Meredith and I drove it from Kansas City out to Seattle. And on the way out, it was in the middle of the winter. It was right after winter break. And she was going out there. We discovered that the heater didn't work on it. I mean, it was bitter cold traveling along the north side of the country through Cheyenne, Wyoming. I remember those moments of just hoping that somehow we would find heat someplace. And after Meredith got the Honda to Seattle, and she was at Seattle Pacific University, we kept hearing reports one after the other of everything that was wrong with this car. You see, you can have a sense that something's going to be just the way it looks, but appearances can be deceiving. And the story told, if there's a story behind the story, can be a story that can be pretty disappointing for us. The reason I share that with you in John chapter 4 this morning is a story about appearances can be deceiving. We've already looked at the story of the Samaritan woman and the response of the Samaritans, and we're going to look at that again in a little bit. But there's a story there of faith, rich, robust faith and belief. And as we move on into the next episode in the end of John chapter 4, we see another group of people characterized by faith as well. But appearances can be deceiving. So it might be helpful to have a Carfax when you're trying to assess whether this is the right car or not. We actually have John 4 to help us assess whether this belief that we've bought into is actually going to sustain us or not. You see, appearances can be deceiving. And we can buy into a belief system that will not sustain us. And we don't even know it until trouble comes along. We don't even see the realities of that. And there are stories in this room of those of us who at times in our life said, I thought I was a person of faith, but then this happened. And I realized that the faith that I embraced when I was in high school no longer works for me in college. The faith that I embraced when I was younger no longer sustains me in the older seasons of my life. And this is what Jesus really wants to do for you, is to say, would you mind taking a closer look at your faith? Because there's faith that will sustain, and there's faith that will not. Some of us are in that place where we say, yep, that's right. There is faith that will not sustain. And for us, the good news is that John helps us sort these things out in the accounts he describes here in John chapter 4. So let's dig into it, okay? Just a couple of notes about this as we get to a point of what are we going to do about it. The first observation to make is that this is a story about healing. There is healing in this story. In verse 45, actually, we read these words. We read, I'll start in verse 43. After 2 days, Jesus left for Galilee. Now, Jesus himself had pointed out that a prophet has no honor in his own country. So we're already wondering, how is he going to be received? But then we hear these words. When he arrived in Galilee, the Galileans welcomed him. They had seen all that he had done in Jerusalem at the Passover festival, for they had also been there. And then we see after that this royal official who knew all, who had heard those stories of everything that Jesus had done in Jerusalem, was there in Galilee in this place. He has a son. His son is close to death, has a fever that everyone thinks is going to kill this young man. And he begs, it says, the word there is repeatedly, it's just urgently, insistently. He doesn't stop asking, Jesus, heal my son, heal my son. The reason why he asked Jesus for that is they had seen the miracles that Jesus had done in Jerusalem. Now, John doesn't tell us what those miracles are, but certainly there were those miracles. We know of one of them. Early on in the Gospel of John, we hear the miracle that actually took place right there in Cana of Galilee. You remember it? It was when Jesus took the water at a wedding banquet, changed it into wine so the banquet didn't crash and burn. He changed the water into the wine. So his imperative to Jesus is this. Literally in the text it is, come, my son will die. Followed by Jesus' parallel words, go, your son will live. This is an assertion of who Jesus is. I mean, it really is a remarkable intervention that Jesus promises to this dad who's in danger of losing his son. And it's healing in a moment. I mean, look at what it says in verses 52 and 53. Let's get to his imperative in verse 3. Go, Jesus replied, your son will live. The man took Jesus at his word and departed. While he was still on the way, his servants met him with the news that his boy was living. When he inquired as to the time when his son got better, they said, yesterday at 1 p.m, the fever left him. Verse 53, then the father realized that this was the exact time at which Jesus had said to him, your son will live. I mean, it's really a remarkable story, almost unbelievable, right? But there were people who were witnessing Jesus do this in many other places as well. And here it is, healing in a moment, and frankly, it's intervention at a distance. I mean, Jesus doesn't even show up. He doesn't put hands on him. He just says, your son will live. It's not the first time, not the only time that Jesus heals at a distance. I want to just stop right here and observe something. This is healing in a moment of a person who we will soon learn has faith that is weak and insufficient. We're going to get there in a little bit. But Jesus chooses to heal the son in a moment at a distance of a person whose faith isn't what you and I think a person's faith need to be in order to have God hear them, right? I mean, this is the notion I've bought into. Well, if you're a person of great faith, if you're a person who is following Jesus, if you're a person of deep faith, God's going to listen to you. Guess what? You're wrong. Not in this text. We see Jesus simply deciding to heal. Just as simple as that. This is a story about healing, and it's remarkable. There's one takeaway from this, and it is this. God does heal. Jesus is interested in displaying his glory, and glory means beyond human comprehension. Jesus is very interested in this. So this dad says, would you heal my son? And Jesus says, it's an opportunity for me to display my glory. You know, just before this, Jesus told the Samaritan woman that true worship is to worship the Lord in spirit. that life is beyond human calculations, mere human calculations. There's a spiritual element to this world we live in, and you just can't simply calculate it. The metaphor he used was of the wind that blows and you can't see it, but you can see what it does. He says there's stuff you can't see, you can't comprehend, you can't understand, but it is no less real. I'm just really taken by artificial intelligence these days. Have you been on ChatGPT? I mean, it's just really kind of fun. And even to talk to the people that kind of know what's going on, and they even say, we don't even know what's going on. You know, it's just almost crazy what it comes up with when you just put particular prompts in it. And we all know that behind the prompts we put in, there's this algorithm that's just crazy good. And it's really easy to say, well, life consists of X's and O's, zeros and ones, an algorithm that seems to work. And Jesus says, no, it is more than even that. Let me show you my glory. It is incomprehensible. So even when I say to you that Jesus heals, you say, that's incomprehensible. And Jesus says, the Father seeks worshipers that worship him in spirit and in truth. But that's what we see here. Jesus chooses to show off, friends. I mean, it's almost as if he's saying, watch this one. When our kids were growing up, I wanted them to know that Jesus could show off. I remember a time shared with some of you when our oldest daughter was in elementary school, and we got to go on a field trip together, and we're talking about God, and she's got all kinds of questions. And I just, deep in my heart, thought, I want my daughter to know that Jesus shows off. That Jesus is beyond human comprehensions, beyond the predictable things that you can assess and say, I saw that one coming. That Jesus has glory. And so Kate and I put together a list. Let's just find out what Jesus can do. Let's just try this. Let's just ask him for something. And so we proceeded to put a list of three or four concerns she had and things she wanted to be different in her life. And I said, okay, Kate, let me add to that. And Jesus wanted me to know that he could show off too. So he rebuked me for the prayer requests that I made that I knew that the answers were already in place. I mean, imagine that. A dad who is so wanting to prop up God that he writes down prayer requests that he knows are already answered. I'm sorry, that's just my life. And I felt the rebuke of that, and so I put down a couple of prayer requests that really mattered to me. It was interesting for Kate and I to go back and look at those things a week later, and for me to be able to say to my daughter, Jesus shows off, doesn't he? And she says, yes. And for God to say to me, I show off, don't I? And for me to say yes. I mean, there is that in this story, that God is one who heals. In verse 54, as Jaron so eloquently described, this miracle is described as a sign. The water into wine was considered a sign, but a sign is a wonder that points to something even more wonderful. That's what we see here. The act of power in itself is less important to John than what the act says about Jesus. The act of power is important, but don't miss what it says about Jesus, because that matters more. It's the wine from water. This is more than Jesus averting a disaster for this young married couple. We learn about Jesus' character here. We discover what matters to him, his concern, no doubt, for the shame that was possible for the couple. But even beyond that Jesus is the bringer of joy and contentment and celebration, and as we'll read in John chapter 10, of life to the full. It's this sense of, I want us to have moments in our life where it feels like a party. That's what it points to, is is a God who wants us to experience joy and celebration and rejoicing. It's pointing to that. The wine was great. It was fine wine. Jesus is more remarkable because of what we see in the midst of this episode. And this sign, Jesus is the one who is the creator of life and the sustainer of life. I love Paul's words to the letter in the Colossians. He is the one in whom all things hold together. They hold together rather than fall apart. And that's what we see here, this sign. This is a story about healing, and it points us to the character of who Jesus is. But there's another element of this, and that is this is a story about believing, and we've already talked about that a bit. The context here is significant. In fact, if we just go a couple verses back, we will see the Samaritans' wholehearted belief in Jesus. I mean, let's look at it. We see, I'll start in verse 39. Many of the Samaritans from the town believed in him because of the woman's testimony. Do you remember what she said? She said, "This man knows everything I ever did." So when the Samaritans came to him, they urged him to stay with them, and he stayed 2 days, and because of his words, many more became believers. Let me read that again. And because of his words, many more became believers. They said to the woman, "We no longer believe just because of what you said. Now we have heard for ourselves, and we know that this man really is the Savior of the world." I mean, isn't that just so remarkable? And then look at the belief of the Galileans. What does Jesus say here? Verse 48. "Unless you people see signs and wonders, you will never believe." Jesus fact checks their belief, and here's the fact. You believe only because you see signs and wonders. Do you see the Samaritans here? A word is spoken and they believe. For the Galileans, wonders are done, and they believed, just like Jesus predicted they would. Carfax helps us see the difference between similar vehicles. This fact check here helps us to see the difference regarding belief. Now you're saying, "I'm not with you yet on this, Mark," but this isn't the first time we see differences in belief. In fact, John sets it up. If we go to back to chapter 2, verses 23 through 25, we read this already. We heard this already. "Now, while he was in Jerusalem at the Passover festival, many people saw the signs he was performing and believed in his name. But Jesus would not entrust himself to them, for he knew all people. He did not need any testimony about mankind, for he knew what was in each person." You see, even there, John has told us, you say the word believe, and guess what? You're talking about two different cars. One works, and one's a Honda Civic. You see, and that's what's happening here. John is showing us two groups of people with a different set of calibration of what it means to believe. Notice John's introduction in verse 45. It says, "When he arrived in Galilee, the Galileans welcomed him." It's interesting. One of the scholars that looks at this says, given the context, John is writing with genuine irony when he talks about the Galileans' welcome. Yeah, sure it was a welcome. It was a welcome. You've shown up. Now we've got a list of things we want from you. There's some things we expect you to do. The same things you did in Jerusalem, we want them here. Welcome. Glad you're here. This is not like the Samaritans. Elsewhere, in fact, Jesus commends the faith of a Roman centurion. Do you remember this one? The Roman centurion comes to Jesus and says, "I need help with my child." And he says, "And you don't even need to come." He says, "Just say the word, and that's all I need." And he goes home and he finds out his child has been healed. And what does Jesus say in that passage? He says this. He says, "I have not found such great faith even in Israel." Does he say that here? No. No, this is not great faith. We see here faith that's hearing the words of Jesus and faith that sees the wonders from Jesus. It is faith that is who you are, Jesus, and it is faith that is what you do, Jesus. Now, let me just back up a little bit. Jesus is not throwing this royal official under the bus here. And we're actually not meant to scold him, to say, look at him. Scold him because of a what have you done for me lately faith. You know why we dare not scold him? Because that's us, isn't it? I mean, doesn't it so quickly morph into that? Or maybe that's the sum total of it? What have you done for me lately, Jesus? Or what did you fail to do for me yesterday, Jesus? You see, Jesus is just nudging us to check the Carfax. Right here in our heart and in our head. What kind of faith is it? Not because he wants to scold us, but because he wants our faith to be sustained. Something that's legit, something that lasts. Don't pick a faith that hasn't calculated what really matters, that doesn't point us to the sign of who Jesus really is. In John chapter 20, we get to the end of this gospel and we read this. Then Jesus told him, this was to Thomas. Remember, he got the moniker Doubting Thomas. He was the kind of guy who just says, you just kind of have to show me. Listen to what Jesus said to Thomas as he loved him and cared for him. He said, because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. Now, don't let the word blessed be a religious word. This crazy, whatever it means, blessing thing. It means enriched. It means that enriched are those who have not seen, who have not held to a faith that is, what have you done for me lately, and ends there. But it is a faith that is enriched by more than what you have done. It is who you are. Do you see where John is taking us? Do you see where Jesus wants us to go here? The Father seeks worshipers who experience a rich faith and an enduring faith. There is a question here for us. Mark, check your faith. What's it based on? What guides it? Where do those highs and lows come from? Is it who Christ is, or is it what Christ has done? Or, as a corollary, not done? John 6, as we move on, Jesus essentially chides him and says, you believe in me because you ate the bread and you had your fill. Those folks, guess what? They soon abandoned Jesus. We'll get there as we read through the Gospel of John. They abandoned Jesus. Their faith lasted about as long as the bread did. And again, Jesus is not throwing these folks under the bus. Thank God he isn't, because this is me from time to time. He's just saying, friends, there is more to me than that. Frankly, this story shouts that. This is the third part of it that I wanted us to get to. This is a story about healing, and this is a story about believing. This is a story about Jesus saying, I am even more than all of that. I do that. I engage in the world in those ways, but I will always be more than that. I mean, you kind of get to the end of the story, and they're believing because the son the fever is left in just that timing. And you get to this end of the story, and you get the sense that John is trying to say to us what Jesus is trying to say to the Galileans. And guess what? I'm more than that. I love you, care about your family. I want you to know, I am more than that. You see, there's a danger in us measuring faith or engaging in a faith life based on what Jesus does or doesn't do. Jesus is more than what he may or may not do at a particular moment in time. Someone has said this: the chief problem with faith anchored in the miraculous is that the miracles become ends in themselves. They do, don't they? The chief problem with faith anchored in the miraculous is that the miracles become ends in themselves. Nothing relational going on here. It's just merely a transaction. Is that what we've bought into, a transactional faith? Up when you do well, walking away when you disappoint me. Augustine weighs in on this, and he compares God's gift to us as a man giving his friend a bracelet. He says this: if she so delights in the bracelet as to forget the giver, that's an insult to him. But if she so delights in the bracelet as to love the giver more, that was what the bracelet was for. That's the more than. It's more than the moment where I do what it is you want me to do for you. It's I want you to see the sign of who I am. Far beyond my faith holds as long as you come through on this. It goes far, far deeper. So concerned is Jesus about this transactional faith that there are times when he tells people, keep this miracle quiet. There are also times when Jesus leaves a village full of people wanting to be healed, lest they think that is all he is, rather than more than that. So, let's wrap this up. What can we take from this account? I want to suggest two things that I see here. One is, I see an encouragement to pray for God's intervention in our circumstances. This man was begging God. I think that's a pretty good posture to have. I mean, his faith wasn't fully formed yet. It was inadequate, but he was begging God. And whether our faith is fully formed or inadequate, this is a good posture to have. To ask, to expect Jesus to show off, to show himself, to worship in spirit, beyond the algorithms, beyond the X's and O's, beyond the human calculations. Ask the Spirit to work, to live a life that is more than normal understandings of cause and effect. Go ahead and ask for it. Ask Jesus to show off. Dave and I were talking about this text this week, and Dave mentioned to me, he says, did you know that Tina and I were wrestling with infertility for 5 years? He says, a mere 60 months. Tongue in cheek, right, Dave? Can you imagine? Some of you know this story, don't you? Infertility, month after month, aborted pregnancy after aborted pregnancy, just this despair along the way. And after 5 years, Grace, their oldest daughter, comes along. God intervened twice in this story. He intervened in the birth of their daughter, Grace, after 5 years. And he also intervened in providing the grace to handle life before Grace was born. In fact, Dave said to me, the cherry on the top was we named her Grace because that's the gift God gave us in those 5 years. You see, there's a danger of us deciding to pack it in because it doesn't, what we ask God for doesn't happen in the moment. In fact, I think there are times when I decide not to pray because I don't want to be brokenhearted, because God won't come through the way He wants, the way I want Him to. You know, I think what this story is actually encouraging me to do is, so what, Mark? Pray anyway. Ask for those things, and when I provide them, make sure you know that the real sign here is I love you. And if God doesn't, guess what? I will be there in that as well. No need to worry. Ask for big things. I want to show off. And one way for me to show off is to provide you the grace and the peace and the courage to continue to live when answers don't come through the way you want them to. See, now we're moving towards the kind of faith that God is inviting us to. All too often, as we grow older, we grow hardened. We don't want the disappointment, but God says, go ahead, let me show off. You know, by the way, just out of this, God did this for our family. I told you this story of my brother Mike, who was a police officer and 27 years old. He was shot in the chin. The bullet resided for months until he took it out in the back of his neck, but it went through his C2, C3, and he lost everything from his neck down. And we just begged God. We just begged God to heal him. I mean, I just thought, God, could you even just give him the dignity of being able to scratch his face? And nothing came back. And the thing we noticed about the gift God gave was the richness in the midst of that was a stunning reminder of what it means for God to be the God of all comfort, for God to be life giver, for us to be in rooms, even in that, filled with laughter and celebration and gratefulness. You see, there's a miracle in that. There's something glorious about a God who says, I want to be in the middle of it. I want to show you that I'm in the center. Let me get to the second point here, and that is this call to believe. Faith that declares Jesus will always be more than what he does, always be more than what he doesn't do. The center of my life is not occupied by what does or does not happen in my life. Oh, that's so easy, isn't it? For the center of our life to be occupied by what God does or does not do, and instead for the center of my life to be Jesus. Jesus at the center. The one who is more than that healing or that disappointment. The call to believe here is to place Jesus at the center of our lives, the one who says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. True worshipers realize that Jesus is more than my life's ups and downs, and we assert it and we say, I will hold to that and believe and live that in all of its truth. You know, the church for centuries has engaged in a couple of practices that allow us to be able to make that declaration that Jesus is at the center. One of the first ones we read about is what we read about in the first part of John. It's baptism. It's this decision we make. I mean, the text talks about we die to ourselves, and there's something symbolic about being dropped underwater and be submerged. And in Romans chapter 6, it talks about dying to ourselves, to be able to say, everything I want, my needs, my wants, my expectations about what life is going to be like and what it's going to give me, I'm putting that to death, and I'm raising to new life where Jesus is at the center of it. I mean, is this really this rich statement? And we can talk about it all we want to, but boy, when it happens, those of you that have had this experience, there is just such a spiritual richness in that baptism experience. And Jesus actually has called us to that experience. Some of you perhaps are saying, I want Jesus to be the center of my life. Here is the expression of that. We say, I want to be baptized. We're actually going to have an opportunity to be able to do this for any of those in this room or that are watching that want to say, that's what I want to do. I want to make a declaration that Jesus is at the center of my life, that I'm dying to me and rising to him. He's right there going to be in the middle of my life. We're actually going to do it before school lets out. So if there are any of you Westmont students who are interested in that, let us know. Right after Easter, which is a time where we celebrate new life in Christ, we're going to have a time where we can gather together and celebrate that. For those of you that say, you know what, I remember that, it was years and years ago, I I would like to remember my baptism. We actually have a opportunity for that too. So I would invite you to consider that. It's a means by which God's people for centuries and centuries have said, Jesus is at the center of my life. He is my all in all. And then there's another, and you can, by the way, if you have one of those comment cards, just put that in or send us an email and say, I'm really interested in this, tell me more. The other one is what we have here in front of us this morning is this communion table, where it's for those of us who have said that we desire, we long to, we intend to follow Jesus, to be reminded over and over again, in our context month after month, I intend to follow Jesus. And we're in a room all filled with needs and concerns. And Jesus, this is what I need. And in the midst of this life that we have, where we're navigating that, we physically come to the center of the room, to the center where the presence of Christ is symbolized by the wine and the bread. And we say, Jesus, be the center. I need you to be more than that. More than all of the things you do for me, I need you to be at the center. More than all of the things that go poorly right now for me, I declare you are still at the center of my life. I mean, listen to these words at the end of this chapter, at the end of the Gospel of John. In John chapter 20, we read these words. Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book, but these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name.